Somewhere in the freezing black water beneath the Antarctic ice, something the size of a whale is said to be watching the surface. Fishermen who claim to have seen it describe a shape too smooth to be a seal, too pale to be a whale, and too symmetrical to be either. A massive ghost white body, limbs where a whale has none, and at the top, where a marine animal should have a blunt, blind head built for pressure and cold, witnesses describe something closer to a face, smooth, featureless, but unmistakably shaped like ours. They call it the Ningen. In Japanese, the word simply means human. And for almost 2 decades now, that name has circulated through forums, YouTube channels, and late night internet rabbit holes as the description of something enormous, human-shaped, and allegedly swimming in the most remote, least witnessed ocean on Earth. The claim is a big one. A creature the size of a sperm whale, shaped like a person, living undetected in the coldest waters on the planet, spotted only by a handful of anonymous witnesses, never captured on reliable video, never recovered, never examined by a single marine biologist. If it's true, it would be one of the most significant zoological discoveries in human history. If it isn't, it's one of the more fascinating case studies in how a modern myth gets built piece by piece in public, in real time, which is exactly the kind of paper trail that's usually invisible when a legend is centuries old. The Ningen is not centuries old, and that turns out to be the most important fact in the entire story. Before going any further, it's worth being upfront about how this investigation is going to work, because a story like this one lives or dies on where its claims actually come from. Every cryptid legend eventually asks the same question of anyone trying to take it. Seriously, is there a trail of evidence here, or is there only a trail of retellings? For some legends, following that trail backward leads to genuine, if inconclusive, physical traces. Footprints, sonar readings, disputed photographs taken by named individuals willing to put their reputation behind the claim. For others, the trail leads somewhere very different. The honest way to investigate. The Ningen is to follow that trail all the way back, as far as it actually goes, and see which kind of legend this turns out to be. To understand what the Ningen actually is, you have to start with what people claim it looks like, because the descriptions themselves are the first clue. Accounts of the creature vary, but they tend to cluster around 2 versions. The first, and by far the more popular, describes an enormous aquatic body, reported at anywhere from 10 to 30 meters long, roughly the size of a large whale, with pale, almost luminous white or grayish skin. Where a whale has flippers, this creature is said to have limbs that resemble human arms, sometimes ending in something like hands. And where a whale has a blowhole and an elongated snout, witnesses describe a rounded, human-like head, occasionally with large, dark, almond-shaped eyes and a small, slit-like mouth, and occasionally described as smooth and featureless, more like a mannequin than a face. The second, much less common version, describes something entirely different. A smaller, land-based figure, walking upright on the Antarctic ice on legs that look distinctly human, with a body silhouette closer to a person in a diving suit than a sea creature at all. Both versions share the same core idea. Something built roughly like a person, at a scale and in a location where nothing like that should exist. And both versions are said to have been seen by essentially the same population of witnesses, crew members aboard fishing and research vessels operating in the Southern Ocean, spotting something break the surface near their ships in conditions of poor visibility, extreme cold, and long hours of isolation. That detail, the setting, is worth sitting with for a moment because it's central to how this story took shape in the first place. It's also worth noticing what the descriptions don't include, because absence can be as telling as detail. Nobody claims to have recovered tissue, bone, or even a torn piece of skin. Nobody describes hearing the creature make a sound. No call, no breach, no distress noise of the kind that would draw attention from a whale-sized animal surfacing near a working vessel. And critically, no research institution, fisheries authority, or Antarctic research program operating in the Southern Ocean has ever logged an official report matching these descriptions, despite the region hosting years of continuous scientific survey work by multiple countries. A creature this large, surfacing near working ships, would be an extraordinary thing for a crew to witness, and then simply never report through any formal channel. That gap between widely described online and never formally reported by anyone with an official role on the water is the first real crack in the story. Here's where the investigation actually begins, because the natural next question is simple. Where does a claim like this come from, and how far back does it go? For a genuinely ancient cryptid, something like the Loch Ness Monster, with reported sightings stretching back centuries, or Bigfoot with a documented trail of regional folklore predating modern media by generations, you'd expect to find scattered historical accounts, older maps with warnings, indigenous oral traditions, or old ship's logs describing something similar, even if garbled or exaggerated over time. The Ningen has none of that. Researchers who have traced the legend's documented history including academic folklorists who specifically studied its spread, have found no accounts from historical Antarctic explorers, no mentions in the logs of 19th or early 20th century whaling expeditions, and no equivalent figure in older Japanese maritime folklore, despite Japan's centuries-long relationship with Antarctic and sub-Antarctic whaling. There's no version of this creature waiting quietly in an old sailor's journal. Instead, when researchers trace the story back to its actual origin point, they land somewhere very specific. An anonymous Japanese internet forum called 2channel, sometime in the early 2000s, with the core version of the legend spreading and solidifying around 2007. Compare that timeline to virtually any other well-known cryptid. The Loch Ness Monster has reported sightings, however unreliable, stretching back to accounts recorded in the 6th century, long before photography or mass media existed to manufacture or amplify a story. Bigfoot draws on a genuine, much older tradition of wild man figures, found across multiple indigenous North American oral traditions, independent of any 20th century hoax. Whatever the truth behind those creatures, their legends at least have centuries of independent, geographically scattered testimony to sift through. The Ningen has roughly 2 decades, almost all of it traceable to a single starting point, in a single format, on a single platform. That's not automatically disqualifying. Every legend has to start somewhere, once, for the first time. But it does mean the Ningen offers something rare, an origin story recent enough and documented well enough that it can actually be checked. Let's pause and take stock of what we actually know at this point, because it matters more than the description of the creature itself. We know the Ningen is described consistently, across most accounts, as an enormous, pale, human-shaped aquatic being, seen almost exclusively by crews on fishing or research vessels in the Southern Ocean. We know there is no pre-internet historical record of this creature, no folklore, no ship's logs, no indigenous accounts, despite a long documented history of human activity in the same waters. And we know the earliest traceable version of the story appears not in any expedition record or eyewitness report filed with a government agency, but in a post on an anonymous online message board, describing a Japanese whale research crew allegedly encountering the creature near their ship. That last point is the hinge the whole legend turns on, and it's worth being precise about what anonymous message board post actually means as a source, because it's very different from an eyewitness report, a ship's log, or a peer-reviewed account of anything. 2channel, often shortened to Tuck, was, and remains, one of the largest anonymous online forums in Japan, structurally similar to early Western image boards. Anyone could post anything under no verified identity, with no editorial oversight and no requirement that a claim be substantiated in any way. It became, over the years, a breeding ground for exactly the kind of creative, collaborative storytelling that thrives in anonymous spaces. Horror stories, urban legends, and elaborate multi-poster fictional scenarios that read to an outside audience encountering only a fragment of the thread later, like genuine first-hand reports. The Ningen legend appears to have emerged from exactly that kind of thread. According to the tracing done by researchers who've studied its spread, the earliest layer of the story dates to around 2002, describing a supposed encounter involving a Japanese whaling research vessel and a massive human-shaped creature surfacing nearby. That original thread faded from attention for several years. Then, around 2007, the story was revived and substantially expanded, this time gaining traction well beyond the original form. That same year, a Japanese magazine devoted to paranormal topics ran a feature connecting the growing online legend to an image, supposedly captured via Google Earth, showing a pale shape in the ocean off the coast of Namibia, thousands of miles from Antarctica, in a different ocean entirely, but close enough to the general theme that it got folded into the mythology anyway. That magazine feature is worth pausing on, because it did something that recurs constantly in the history of modern folklore. It took an internet-born story, presented it in a print publication with the visual trappings of investigative journalism, and in doing so gave an anonymous forum post a credibility it had never actually earned. Readers encountering the Ningen through that magazine or through the countless secondhand blog posts and videos that followed it had no way of knowing the trail led back to an anonymous creative writing thread. They just saw a magazine article treating it as a real, unresolved mystery, and the legend grew from there. This pattern of laundering an internet rumor into something resembling credible journalism is not unique to the Ningen, and recognizing it is part of what makes this particular investigation useful beyond the specific creature at its center. A claim posted anonymously online carries essentially no evidentiary weight on its own. But once that claim gets picked up, quoted, and republished by an outlet with the visual format of a magazine or news site, complete with headlines, layout, and a byline, a significant number of readers will register it as vetted information simply because of where and how it was presented, without ever checking whether anyone involved in the reprinting had done any actual verification. The Ningen's jump from forum thread to paranormal magazine feature is a small, well-documented example of exactly that laundering process happening in real time, which is part of why researchers studying internet folklore have found it such a useful case to study. This is where the investigation has to be honest about something uncomfortable, because it changes how the rest of this story should be read. Multiple independent researchers who have specifically traced the Ningen's documented history, rather than simply repeating secondhand accounts of it, describe its own origin not as a garbled retelling of a real encounter, but as a piece of deliberate, collaborative internet fiction. Some accounts describe the original two-channel thread explicitly as a creative writing exercise, with multiple anonymous users building on each other's additions the way people build a shared story in a role-playing thread, rather than describing something any of them had actually witnessed. That doesn't make the Ningen a boring story. If anything, it makes it a more interesting one, because it means the mystery here isn't really about what's swimming under the Antarctic ice. It's about how a piece of anonymous internet fiction, written collaboratively by people who likely never intended anyone to take it literally, became convincing enough, spread widely enough, and got reprinted seriously enough in paranormal media that within a decade it had become a genuine fixture of global cryptid culture, discussed with the same tone of unresolved mystery normally reserved for creatures with actual multi-generational sighting histories. None of this means every element of the story is impossible, and it's worth being fair about what a careful skeptic would actually say, rather than dismissing the whole subject outright. The Southern Ocean, genuinely, is one of the least explored marine environments on Earth. Its combination of extreme cold, remoteness, and near total darkness for large stretches of the year means that scientific survey coverage there is thinner than almost anywhere else in the world's oceans. New marine species, some of them large, continue to be formally described in poorly surveyed deep and polar waters even now, which means unexplored ocean, unexpected creature, is not by itself an unreasonable premise for a documentary hook. But there's a wide gap between the ocean holds species we haven't cataloged yet and a whale-sized, human-shaped animal exists undetected. Skeptics who have examined the Ningen phenomenon point to a short list of much more mundane explanations for any genuine visual encounters that might have fed into or been retroactively folded into the legend. Unusual icebergs or ice formations, glimpsed at a distance in low light, which can take on strange, almost organic shapes. Known marine mammals like leucistic or partially pigment-deficient whales and seals, whose pale, irregular coloring can look genuinely startling against dark water. And simple misidentification under the exact conditions the legend keeps describing: poor visibility, extreme fatigue, long isolation, and a mind primed after months at sea to see shapes and patterns in ambiguous stimuli. None of that requires inventing a new species. It just requires ordinary human perception operating under difficult conditions, later reinterpreted through the lens of a story that was already circulating. It's also worth being honest that no photograph, video, biological sample, stranding, or physical trace connected to the Ningen has ever been examined by a marine biologist, a research institution, or any government body with jurisdiction over Antarctic or sub-Antarctic waters. The alleged imagery that circulates online, including the Google Earth screenshot from the 2007 magazine feature, has never been independently verified as depicting anything unusual at all, let alone a specific, consistent creature. There's a useful comparison here to how legitimate marine biology actually handles claims of unidentified large animals. When credible reports of an unfamiliar species do surface, a beaked whale never before documented alive, an unusual squid recorded on deep-sea camera, the process that follows looks nothing like the Ningen's history. Researchers publish coordinates, methodology, and raw footage. Specimens, when recoverable, are examined and cataloged by named institutions, with findings submitted for peer review before anyone declares a new species confirmed. That process can take years, and plenty of legitimate reports never get fully resolved. But the process itself, transparent, attributable, and checkable, is what separates a genuine zoological mystery from a story that only exists as retellings of retellings. The Ningen has never entered that process at any point in its nearly two-decade history, which is a very different kind of absence than simply not yet proven. So where does that leave the investigation? The honest answer is this: the Ningen, as a literal undiscovered species swimming beneath Antarctica, has no supporting evidence that would meet even a basic scientific standard. No specimen, no verified photograph, no formal report filed by any research vessel or government agency operating in the region. Every trail that researchers have followed backward leads not to open water, but to an anonymous message board, a piece of collaborative fiction, and a paranormal magazine that dressed an internet legend up in the visual language of investigative journalism. But the Ningen, as a modern folklore phenomenon, is completely real. Real in the sense that matters for understanding how legends work today. It's a documented case study in how a story with no historical roots, no eyewitness credibility, and no physical evidence can nonetheless spread across borders, get reprinted as if it were a serious unsolved mystery, and eventually become embedded deeply enough in internet culture that entire communities discuss it with the same tone of hushed uncertainty usually reserved for legends with actual centuries of testimony behind them. That's not a smaller story than giant humanoid discovered in Antarctica. In some ways, it's a stranger one. It means the myth-making machinery that once took generations, passed down through oral tradition, village to village, sailor to sailor, can now happen in a matter of months, entirely in public, with a paper trail anyone can follow back to its actual source. And that even with that paper trail sitting in plain sight, the story still took hold, still got repeated as serious mystery, and still, to this day, gets asked about as though it might be real. Which brings the story back to that cold, dark water beneath the Antarctic ice. There is almost certainly nothing down there shaped like us, waiting at whale scale, unseen, by every research vessel and satellite survey that has ever passed through those waters. What's actually down there, in the fullest sense the evidence supports, is a story. One born on an anonymous forum, dressed up by a paranormal magazine, and carried forward ever since by people who found the idea too unsettling, too vivid, and too much fun to let go of, regardless of where it actually came from. That doesn't make the Ningen worthless as a subject. It makes it a genuinely useful lens for understanding something true about how modern mystery actually gets manufactured. Not in a hidden cave or a classified file, but in plain sight, on a public forum, by anonymous people who may never have intended for anyone, years later, to ask whether it was real. So here's the question worth sitting with. If a story this thin, no historical record, no physical evidence, a traceable origin on an anonymous forum, could still convince enough people to keep the legend alive for nearly 2 decades, what does that say about every other unsolved mystery whose origin story nobody has bothered to trace all the way back? If you've heard the Ningen legend before, or seen the alleged footage yourself, drop a comment on whether tracing it back to an anonymous forum thread changes how you see it, or whether for you, the mystery of the deep ocean is enough to keep the story alive regardless. Either answer says something real about how modern myths survive, long after their origin point has been found.